So in this last segment, we're going to look at some of the contemporary or issues that might be more an issue now, as opposed to say in the past, that managers might face in the workplace. And the two key ones that we're going to have a look at is the different decision-making practices that exist across cultures, and the issue of creativity and how do we manage and cultivate it within organisations. So first of all, you might remember back to the globe framework that we looked at in the last chapter last week, which talked about the differences that different cultures have in their orientation around things like interest in individuals versus collectives, differences in acceptance and of power structures, differences in terms of the way their avoidance of uncertainty or they're willing to take risks. And so given these different cultural perspectives, it makes sense that this translates into the ways that different organisations work and different managerial approaches. And so as global citizens and potentially working across cultures, this can affect our ability to manage or to be managed if we have differences in cultural practices that are influencing the way in which we manage. And so if we're, as Australia, we tend to be much more in an individualistic type culture than say a country like Japan, which is more interested in collective decision making because they have a much more collectivist culture. And so if we're, say, collaborating with an organisation that's Japanese, or if we start to work with Japanese team members, they might be more interested and expect that we would come together as a team and build consensus around an issue, whereas we might be just used to making more of a decision on the fly rather than that more collective approach. Similarly, in other countries, there might be differences between how much risk a manager is willing to take. And so where we might have cultural differences there, where say someone from a Nordic country, which is much more oriented to being comfortable with taking risks and comfortable with uncertainty, people from other cultures might be much more risk adverse. And so this influences their ability to manage, and it will also influence how they're perceived by others as managers. And so we need to be thinking about this stuff when we're working interculturally, not for the purpose of stereotyping or making assumptions about people, but just so that we can, as good managers, navigate these things and have a bit of an understanding around why certain things might be happening, and then how we might address them if there is a tension or a difference there. The next issue we're going to look at is the issue of creativity. And obviously, as people interested in working in a creative industry, which is the music industry, this is going to be a really important one for you to be thinking about and working how you're going to work in the creative space that in a way that both cultivates and manages creativity, because we can, to a degree, be too creative and not necessarily be having people working towards the same kind of goals. And sometimes a lot of work that's managerial is quite routine. And so being able to have almost wear the two hats of being a creative individual, which is important and useful, but how do you manage if you have a very creative identity, but you're also involved in a lot of routine and possibly repetitive tasks that don't necessarily require much creativity and may be a frustration for you if you are a creative. And the other thing to keep in mind is that often we think of creativity as this sort of innate thing, that you're either an artist or you're not. And what's very clear is that creativity can be a skill. And so there's a distinction between what we might call talent and what we might call creativity. And so creativity has been found to have these three components, or let's call them ingredients, that work together. And so let's start to unpack them a little bit. So we have expertise, creative thinking skills, so the actual ability to do that, and what we call intrinsic motivation. So let's dive into each of them. So expertise I think that's a fairly obvious one. It's your actual abilities and your skills, the things that you can do and the things that you can do very well. So, you know, we might think of someone as being an expert guitarist. You know, they're very skilled. They might have practiced the guitar for decades or years and years and years. They may have an innate talent for it as well, but it's a skill that they've improved and built over time. But you can have expertise in a lot of different things. You know, we have people who are very senior and known in their field, that are expert as managers or decision makers or negotiators, or they might be experts in working with people. And so these are all different areas that we can think of as having a creative element, because we can build our skills and expertise in them over time. And if we're bringing in the creative thinking skills and that intrinsic motivation with them, then we can use creativity to enhance these skills and activities that we might not necessarily assume are creative to begin with. So the ability to think creatively, and just going back to the actual definition of creativity, which is that when we're thinking about being creative, or what we mean by creativity, is the ability to come up with new ideas and to use those ideas in some way, shape or form, or to apply new ideas, right? So for example, we might have someone who's very good at taking someone's composition, someone's music, say if they're working with an artist and they're a record producer or they're a A&R person, and crafting that person's persona, crafting their career. You know, these are kind of creative activities as well that involve taking someone else's ideas, but then adding to and enhancing them, and adding their own ideas on top of them. Yeah, so we don't have this idea that creativity is just, you only have to create the new, but also the ability to take the new and enhance it and apply it out in the world in some way, shape or form. So if you think of the partnership between Steve Jobs and Wozniak, Wozniak was actually the very creative person who was very skilled at designing computers, but he wasn't great. He wasn't a great business person. And so Steve Jobs' ability was his creative ability to actually see what Wozniak was creating in these new types of computers, and then creatively take them out into the world and create companies and connect with customers in a way that actually made those computers become real out in the world. And so that skill and being able to bring those creative thinking skills to novel ideas, either in terms of creating those ideas yourself or applying your own creative thinking skills to others' ideas, is part of the skills that we're interested in developing in you in this unit and as practitioners out in the creative industries in the world. And then our last component of creativity is what we call intrinsic motivation. So this is a term that comes from psychology. And so we talk about two types of motivation. Intrinsic motivation is, you can think of it as motivation that comes from inside you. And the other type of motivation is what we call extrinsic or external motivation. And so that's the type of motivation that is coming from outside of you, say. So the distinction here is that intrinsic motivating, in things that are intrinsically motivating, are the kinds of things that you want to do because it's interesting to you, or it gives you some sense of fulfillment, a sense of personal challenge, and it's what lights you up. Extrinsic motivators tend to be things like other people's expectations, things like money, you know, so you're doing a task just because you got to do that job, and so if you don't do that job, you're not going to get paid this week, so you do that job. And so while we always have a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, we, generally speaking, the more we can be aligned to our intrinsic motivators in the work that we're doing, one, the more personally fulfilling it's going to be. And secondly, the more creativity that's going to be engaged in what we're going to be doing, because we're going to be tapping into something that's actually more oriented to who we are, and is then going to stimulate our creativity. So in addition, as managers, we also need to be aware of some of the potential barriers to creativity, so either for ourselves or for our team. And so the key barriers that have been identified are the following, and you can probably notice times that you've experienced this yourself. So, you know, and it's not important what kind of work you're doing. So, you know, you can be creative working in a cafe or whatever it is, because it's about your ability to actually solve problems and come up with novel solutions to situations. And so if you've ever been in a situation where you felt like you just couldn't improve things, or that you just were kind of, you know, on a bit of a treadmill, it's quite possible that some of these barriers to your creativity were happening. So these are the key things that have been identified. First of all, expected evaluation, right? So if you go into a situation, like an exam, it might be a good example. Or if you know that you're going to be watched doing what you're going to do, that really limits your creativity, because what happens is your brain is kind of focused on the evaluation rather than what you're actually doing. So if you think that you're going to be judged, you know, like maybe a driving test might be a good example, where you're probably going to feel quite stressed, because you're being evaluated on your performance. So it's not so much about you just doing what you're doing, you're thinking about the judgment that is going to be attached to what you're doing. The other thing is surveillance, which is a kind of similar thing. So if you know that you're being watched doing what you're doing, you're not going to be as engaged in what you're doing, and you're going to be more focused on, am I being judged? Am I doing it right? Because I'm being watched, and so I need to make sure I'm doing it right, rather than trying to improve or find new ways of doing what you're doing. We also talked a second about the difference between internal or intrinsic motivation and external motivation or extrinsic motivators. So again, external motivators, so, you know, where we might be, you know, it's all about someone else's expectations, or being motivated for things that don't really matter that much to you internally. So possibly, you know, winning a prize or some sort of status or purely financial rewards. These tend to be limits and barriers to our creativity. That said, though, sometimes these things can spur us on. Yeah, so something like a deadline can often sometimes help us to be more creative, because it strips away our inner critics and stuff like that, and just gets us focused on what we're actually doing. So we need to judge these things and hold them a little bit lightly, and also just be aware of what works for us. Yeah, so is this external motivator helping or hindering my creativity? If it's hindering, how might I reduce it, or shift my perception of this motivation to something that's more helpful? Another barrier has been found to be competition. So if you're in an environment that's quite competitive, again, it takes your focus away from what you're actually doing, and it then becomes more about beating or winning or losing, yeah? And so this becomes then one of these external motivators, which is to, you know, beat the competition as opposed to the actual task or the project that you're working on. And then our last barrier is constrained choices. So, you know, I'm sure we've all had the experience of like, well, you just got to do it this way. And so clearly, if you're told that there's only one way to do something and that's the way you have to do it, it becomes obviously very difficult to start thinking about new ways of doing it or ways to improve it, or even to think about why is it being done at all, or could it be done in a different way? And so we need to be thinking about this as managers. The more kind of we're starting to be quite rigid in not enabling people to make choices around the way that they approach tasks, or the kinds of tasks that they are doing. And balancing this can be quite challenging as a manager, because you've got jobs that need to be done. You've got goals within the organisation that you're working towards, and you're trying to be efficient and effective by managing those resources well in order to attain those goals. And so you can't just be having people kind of go off and just do whatever they want because it's, their creative inspiration is that's where they're taking them. And so balancing this in the creative industries can be quite challenging. And as well as that, constraint can often be a really good stimulator of creativity. So many of the activities that we do to build people's creativity, we actually put constraints in, such as time, which, can, again, strip out people's overthinking of something, and they just kind of get in and do it, and they're not kind of going, oh, but I'm not creative, I can't do this. Or we give them deliberate choices, such as, all right, in this example, you have to do it that it's, there's no, you can only, the solution has to be less than $20. And so it forces people to think in a constrained way, which opens up new creative options to them. So this idea of constraint can work in both ways, but generally speaking, the more people are constrained in the way that they're able to operate, it basically trains them to stop thinking creatively, because they're not rewarded, or often that they're kind of punished for being creative. So we've got to keep these things in mind and keep a bit of a balance around them.